Good evening. Welcome to the fourth session of pregnancy medicine. Look out for a surprise announcement tomorrow. We are giving you one more session. One of the pediatricians who never teaches general practitioners but only pediatricians is going to talk and going to give us tips on how to manage problems in young children less than a year or 2 years. I'm also trying to get a psychiatrist to come and talk of postpartum psychosis and postpartum depression. Today, Dr. Alkamam will start with diabetes in pregnancy and small talk on puerperal sepsis. As you all know, Alkamam has written a book of pregnancy medicine, which is having contribution from almost 48 specialists. The book is freely available on Amazon. Those of who are interested can look at it and purchase it. Over to Alka ma'am for the first part of the talk. Rohan, please start. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to meet you all again. Diabetes is a burning topic. As you know, it is an epidemic in India, and therefore, it is also of importance in pregnancy. So, today we'll have some brief review of pregnancy and diabetes. As you all know, diabetes is known from the era of Sushruta. And Sushruta was doing even surgery in that era. So the first description in Indian medicine comes from Sushruta and then elaborated by Charak about diabetes. Now when there was nothing available and diabetes was so rampant, this study was done in Joslin Clinic way back in 1949. At that time, they have reported this because after that insulin became available and then so many other drugs became available. But what is therefore I am using this old slide. Pregnancy outcome in diabetes. Spontaneous abortions in 25%, fetal loss in 18%, stillbirth 80% and neonatal death 75%, and macrosomia, a huge body of a fetus, and metabolic instability in 80%. So the pregnancy outcome was not very satisfactory in diabetes in pre-insulin era. And this is another study which has been recently done in London and which shows the stillbirths, perinatal death and neonatal death in type 1 and type 2 diabetes. What are the complications because of diabetes if the mother is diabetic? There are fetal or neonatal deaths, congenital malformations are seen in the child, preterm deliveries, preeclampsia, macrosomia, increased need for C-section and high maternal mortality. So both the fetus as well as mother are affected. What is the cause of congenital malformations? It is believed that severe hyperglycemia is the cause of congenital malformation. Along with this glucose, there are other metabolic substrates like hydroxybutyrate and pyruvate. These substrates, metabolic substrates, increase the oxidative stress. With the oxidative stress, there are increased free radicals. They cause mitochondrial swelling and DNA damage. And as a result, when the DNA is damaged, naturally there will be genetic defects and this will form into congenital malformations. What is the definition of GDM and pre-GDM? GDM, as you all know, is a gestational diabetes mellitus. That means it occurs, it is detected during pregnancy, that is GDM. But if diabetes is present before pregnancy, then it is called as a pre-GDM. So type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes existing before conception are called as pre-GDM, and GDM is a gestational diabetes mellitus. Now, if there is already a mother who is diabetic, known diabetic, she needs a comprehensive preconception counseling, because she has to first accept the disease, then she has to go for conception, she has to take care of herself as well as the fetus, she has to control her blood sugar and HbA1c. The DM management during pregnancy and labor is slightly different, and then the postpartum care is also very important. Therefore, in pre-GDM, it requires a comprehensive preconception counseling. In preconception counseling, education regarding diabetes. So we have to educate this mother if she has not received enough of information about diabetes. We have to emphasize on lifestyle modification. What do we mean by lifestyle modification? People have a misconception that lifestyle modification means that you reduce the weight. So that is not correct. Lifestyle modification, in addition to maintaining the healthy weight, by nutritional control, by regular exercises, by managing your work parameters, because nowadays, at least urban area, most of the women are working, so they have to manage their work as well as their nutritional and exercise problems. Particularly during pregnancy, she has to take small frequent meals, so she can't go on a breakfast, lunch and dinner. She has to have meals, so she has to adjust to. Medical nutrition therapy is something which has newly come up, and there is psychosocial evaluation. In addition to this, she must learn about self-monitoring of the blood glucose. We have to do her complete medical assessment. Medical assessment means we have to do her fundoscopy, ECG, heart and respiratory, everything. Because diabetics are prone to lung infections like tuberculosis or maybe pneumonia, pneumonitis. So a complete medical checkup and assessment has to be done. Glucose control prior to conception is a must, and we have to do a therapy modification. This is what we will see one by one. Reduction of weight in high BMI. But if she is underweight, then she should eat properly and come to a normal weight. So reduction of weight in high BMI, time management, regularity of meals, because most of the working women tend to skip their meals, or maybe there is a misconception again. By skipping the meals, they can maintain their figure, they can maintain their weight. It is wrong. Whatever body requires, we have to give those calories to the body. There is no point in burning your proteins. We have to burn the glucose for our energy requirements. So time management and regularity of meals is very important. Another thing, if you are taking irregular meals, there will be irregular secretion of insulin. And in addition to that, it will also lead to hyperacidity. So time management is very important, and she has to manage her work as well as her meals, and regularity has to be maintained. Working pattern has to be a set pattern, because we have seen lot of complications for people, working women who are working in shifts. So if there is a night shift, there is a different kind of a stress. And then if they go on changing the shift, for 1 week it is night shift, for one week it is a day shift. Even this we have seen, in most of the telephone operators, most of our nursing staff. And therefore, after conception, at least in JJ Hospital, we had decided that from second trimester, we will give them a fixed duty. There will not be a shift duty. So working pattern has to be checked. Avoidance of stress. Nowadays, at least in the higher class, no smoke, alcohol and intake and smoking is increasing. So we have to do the counseling about that, and regular exercise. Regular exercise, I don't, they have to go to the gym and do all those exercises. But regular exercise, the best exercise for them is 30 minutes walk. 30 minutes they can do at a stretch, or they can do in 3 sessions, like 10 minutes each, so 30 minutes, or they can do in 2 sessions. But in a day, 30 minutes walk is a must. Slides तिकडचे आहेत का? माझ्या नाही आहेत त्या. ह्या करते म्हणून सांगत exercise. Walking for 30 minutes per day is essential. That is also to maintain not only stamina but also the physical fitness. Psychosocial evaluation. First of all, they must accept their disorder. You know, you can't go on blaming your parents or your environment or this and that. And most of the people, they have read somewhere and therefore they blame the diabetes on the stress. Office stress, work stress. See, stress just contributes to increasing hyperglycemia. But stress is not the cause. The stress that these people mean, that is not the cause of diabetes. So they must learn to accept their disorder. That yes, okay, there is a diabetes, I have to deal with it. There are many conditions which are lifelong. Asthma also could be lifelong. But apart from that, hypertension, diabetes, these are lifelong processes and we have to keep them under control. It is not very difficult. But first of all, they must learn to accept it. There are so many conditions. I mean, in every system, I can tell you so many conditions. So acceptance of disorders. Then their attitude towards diabetes has to be positive. Diabetes does not mean the end of life. The people are living long enough like normal people. Only thing, there are certain restrictions that they have to follow. Otherwise, there is no change. And therefore, their attitude towards diabetes has to be positive. They must define what is their quality of life, what is their expectation. And maybe there will be some restrictions about their definitions of or their dreams of enjoyment. That is the only thing. But if they follow that, their life expectancy will be as normal as anybody else. So structured psychotherapy is given and psychopharmacotherapy is also given if necessary for these people. Exercise. This is again from American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists. Now, when these people, even pre-conception, when they are doing exercises, the best is walking, as I said. Avoid supine position. Because when they conceive, it will be very difficult to take supine position and do the exercises. So avoid supine position, avoid risk of imbalance. Because with the imbalance, there may be a fall and that may cause fetal trauma. Aerobic exercises are contraindicated during pregnancy. Please remember that. Therapy modifications. Now, these are pre-GDM that we are talking. So the people who are already known diabetics, particularly, now there are many different types of diabetes. So it is not necessary that just because she has been detected to be diabetic at the age of 25 or 27, that she is a insulin dependent diabetes. These are the people nowadays, they are like maturity onset or type 2 diabetes and they are taking oral hypoglycemic drugs. So these people, whatever therapy that they are taking, we have to go through the therapy that they are taking and we have to switch them to insulin. I'll come to this in the next slide. Stop ACE inhibitors, omit ARBs and stop lipid lowering agents during pregnancy. So even before pregnancy, when they have planned it, we can stop and use the alternative therapies. What are the investigations? As I said, medical assessment. We should do fundoscopy, CBC, blood sugar, fasting and post-lunch blood sugar, HbA1c, lipids, We should do serum TSH and TPO antibodies because they are again related with the diabetes, ferritin, ECG, 2D echo, and microalbuminuria. What are the glycemic targets before conception? This is what we have to achieve. The pre-meal blood sugar should be 80 to 110 milligrams. 1 hour postprandial blood sugar should be 100 to 155 milligrams. 1 hour postprandial, I'm saying. And HbA1c should be less than 7% or as close to normal as possible without resulting in severe hypoglycemia. At any cost, we can't afford to have a hypoglycemia. So hypoglycemia has to be avoided. Hyperglycemia has to be kept under control, and therefore there is a little delicate balance so that A1C has to be less than 7 or as close to normal. Oral hypoglycemic agents in pregnancy, why they are not used or they should not be used? Because there is no adequate safety data about their use in pregnancy. There are some papers which say metformin can be used, but in US and Europe, no OHAs are used during pregnancy because there is no safety data. There is a lack of controlled trials. What is most important is that most of these drugs have a duration of action which is long. It may be 24 to 36 hours. And therefore, there is no flexibility. Just imagine a lady who is vomiting excessively during her morning sickness in her second trimester, and she is on this long-acting oral hypoglycemic agents. Surely she will go into a hypoglycemia, which we do not want at any cost. And therefore, we want a drug which has the flexibility, which we can give small doses and as many times as possible and control the sugar. So, long duration of action of oral hypoglycemic agents is not acceptable. Non-flexibility of dosing, as you know, because there is 24 to 36 hours of action once a day or twice a day, and there is no flexibility. All these oral hypoglycemics are contraindicated in US and Europe, and also in India. Most of us, we immediately switch to insulin. Insulin is a gold standard because its efficacy is established. Yes, that is one more thing. Now, there are so many oral hypoglycemic agents. They have different mechanisms of action. There are different sites of actions of these drugs. However, majority of them, they act on beta cells of pancreas. They stimulate the release of insulin. Okay? And therefore, it all depends how much insulin reserve is there, how much stimulation that these drugs will cause, whether it will be in physiological range. So all these problems are there. And therefore, the efficacy and safety of the oral hypoglycemic agents is not established. Therefore, it is better that we go to the gold standard, and that is insulin. There is an efficacy which is established. The safety is established because insulin does not cross the placenta. And there is a flexibility of insulin dosage. There are insulins which are short acting and there are intermediate acting. And you can use any of these. If it is short acting, these are regular human insulin. Then there are synthetic insulins which are now available freely like Lispro and Aspart. There are intermediate acting insulins like NPH. And then there are synthetic insulins like Glargine and Detamir, and they are called as basal insulin. They are given at night as a basal bolus dose, and that maintains the basal insulin level throughout the 24 hours. Okay. So there are basal insulins, there are intermediate acting like NPH or lente insulin, and there are short acting. And we can give the combination of short and intermediate acting insulin. So we have flexibility of dosing, we have facility of combining these two and making the life more comfortable than OHA. What are the insulin requirements? Insulin requirements by and large are 0.6 units per kg per day. This is in a normal non-pregnant woman, 0.6 units per kg per day. Now during first trimester, that is 5th week to 12th week, The first trimester, we increase the dose to 0.7 units per kg per day. In the second trimester, it is 0.8 units per kg per day. Now see, this is to start with. And then we have to titrate it with the blood sugar level, because the blood sugar level is going to depend on so many factors, like what is her genetic makeup, what is her metabolic status, what is the food intake, what is her amount of exercises that she is doing. So we have to titrate the dose. But to start with, this is a guide that tells us that 0.8 units per kg per day is an approximate daily requirement of a second trimester mother. Then third trimester, 0.9 units per kg per day, and at term it should be 1 unit per kg per day. So these are the insulin requirements of a pregnant woman. Now, if we calculate a total dose, this is roughly I am telling you, because there are so many protocols. Most of them I have discussed in my book, but the book that you follow or the guidelines that you follow will slightly differ in this description. Now, when we give insulin, total dose of insulin, that is called as big I, and big I is 0.6 units per kg per day. Depending on the trimester, you will give trimester specific 0.7 or 0.8. So here I have calculated as 0.6. 0.6, when we calculate, there is a particular dose of insulin that has come to you. Of that big I, we will give 4/9 of big I plus 2/9 of big I. See, NPH is 4/9 of big I. And regular insulin is 2/9 of the big I. This is given before breakfast. Okay, so the before breakfast dose is quite high because it will be covering before breakfast and also the lunch period. So NPH 4/9 of big I plus 2/9 of a regular insulin. Then before dinner, we will give only regular insulin, that is 1/6 of big I. And before bedtime, again we give NPH 1/6 of big I. So this 2/1/6 becomes one third, and the 2/3 is given in the morning. Do you follow this slide? Little, you go through this and you will remember it. So first we calculate the total dose of insulin, that is taken as a big I, that we divide between NPH and regular insulin, and this is the proportion that we give before breakfast, before dinner, and before bedtime. During labor, NPH dose at the previous night is given. No subcutaneous insulin on the day of cesarean section or on the day of labor. Okay, because her intake will be poor, so no subcutaneous insulin is given. Normal saline infusion is started. 1 hourly blood glucose level is monitored, and depending on that blood glucose, we give regular insulin as a bolus dose. When the active labor starts, give glucose infusion along with insulin. Why? Because we have to maintain a normoglycemia in labor or during C-section. We have to maintain it. So give glucose. With the glucose infusion, go on monitoring the sugar and go on adjusting the insulin bolus. When it is a question of a nursing mother. Now, nursing mother, her caloric requirement is high. Caloric requirement is 27 kilocalories per kg per day. Okay. Now we said total dose is 0.6 units per kg per day. So you calculate the total dose, but in a nursing mother, we don't give the full dose, we give 5/6 of this dose. And of this 5/6, 2/3 dose is given before breakfast, again as NPH plus regular insulin. 1/6 regular insulin before dinner, and 1/6 NPH at bedtime. Because after delivery, the mother's insulin requirement reduces. So from 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 and 1 unit at term, now we come down to 0.6, but even from 0.6, we are reducing the insulin. 0.6 we take it for calculation, but 5/6 of that dose is given throughout the day. Now we come to gestational diabetes mellitus. What is this gestational diabetes mellitus? The mother is not a known diabetic, type 1 or type 2. She has been a normo or euglycemic all throughout. Now, pregnancy induces progressive changes in maternal carbohydrate metabolism. As pregnancy advances, insulin resistance and diabetogenic stress due to placental hormones necessitate compensatory increase in insulin secretion. So, in every woman, see, pregnancy is a diabetogenic state. Why? Because the placental hormones, they are increasing the insulin resistance and they are causing hyperglycemia. So as they cause the hyperglycemia, there are a lot of hormones which are secreted during pregnancy. In addition to that, there will be placental hormone. So because of this increasing requirement of insulin, the normal pancreas should be able to secrete that increased requirement of insulin. When this compensation is inadequate, that means when mother's pancreas is unable to secrete the required insulin, then in the mother there will be a hyperglycemia, and that is called as gestational diabetes. Okay? Pregnancy induces progressive changes in maternal carbohydrate metabolism. As pregnancy advances, insulin resistance and diabetogenic stress due to placental hormones necessitate compensatory increase in insulin secretion. So when this compensatory insulin secretion is inadequate, that is GDM. How the GDM is diagnosed? Now these are the two different diabetics associations. On the right hand side is International Association of Diabetes in Pregnancy Study Group. They say if any one of this is present, it is GDM. In the pregnant mother, if the fasting is more than 92, if 1 hour level is more than 180, or if the 2 hours level postprandial is 153, that is taken as gestational diabetes. On the other side, you are seeing is diabetes in pregnancy study group in India. Why in India? Because this international association did not involve most of the developing countries, not from the sub-Saharan Africa, not the Asian countries except Singapore, Hong Kong, and I think Bangkok. Except these three, no other country was involved. Our ethnicity is different. Our economic status is different. Our health infrastructure is different. And considering all that, in the Indian study group, they studied what will be the definition of GDM. Now, for an antenatal mother, when a pregnant mother, it is okay when we are in the urban area. But even in urban area, most of the women, they go very late to a gynecologist or to a doctor. If they come early, it is most welcome. But in the rural setting, most of the women, they go very late. Then if you ask them that we have to do your glucose tolerance test and you will be required to give 5 blood samples, they will never turn up. Again, there is a problem of transport, there is a problem of finance, and there is a problem of time. And therefore, considering all these factors, our diabetes in pregnancy study group in India decided that if 2 hours post glucose level is 140 or more than that, that is pregnant GDM. So when the patient comes to you, give 75 grams of oral glucose, and after that, whether the patient is fasting, non-fasting, that doesn't matter. Give 75 grams of glucose, and 2 hours after that, if the post-glucose blood sugar is more than 140, that is the GDM, gestational diabetes. When it is GDM, what should be the targets of blood glucose? Fasting venous plasma glucose should be less than 95. 1 hour should be less than 140, and 2 hour postprandial should be less than 120. A1C less than 6. So if in an urban setting, if a patient comes to you, patient is affording and patient is willing to do all this, you can do all these. But any one of this also will satisfy the criteria to call it a GDM. Fasting less than 95, 1 hour less than 140, and 2 hours less than 120 are the normals. If it is more, it is GDA. What is the management? Management first is medical nutrition therapy. And this is a specialized therapy. It is not that we ask the woman to reduce her weight. During pregnancy, she is going to gain the weight. If she is underweight, we have to give high caloric diet. Okay. So in my book, we have written a separate chapter on medical nutrition therapy. So we first adjust with the therapy that she is not secreting ketones in the urine. She is well fed. At the same time, the glucose is remaining normal. After medical nutrition therapy, we advise her exercises. And with these two, if the sugar, fasting blood glucose is more than 120, then naturally she requires a treatment and insulin is started. So this is the book that I was telling you, and Dr. Asrani also spoke to you. Most of the aspects of pregnancy medicine has now come up as a subspecialty. In most of the countries, it is practiced as a separate specialty or a separate discipline. Okay, so this is about diabetes in pregnancy and what is gestational diabetes. So in any condition, please avoid all the oral hypoglycemic agent. Insulin is the only treatment. Even if the patient goes into, if there is any emergency, if there is any ketosis or severe hyperglycemia, we can give regular insulin as an infusion. We can give it IV. We can give it every 1 hourly bolus by checking the blood sugar level. And therefore, insulin is the gold standard in the treatment. And this is what you have to tell the patient before conception as a preconception counseling, that she has to accept insulin therapy. And nowadays we get those insulin pens. It is very easy to administer, but only thing, people have that insulin phobia and they have some misconception that once insulin started, that means for lifelong I'll have to take insulin. No. After the delivery, we can again go back. If it is a pre-GDM, we can go back to OHA. And if it is gestational diabetes, this question doesn't arise. Then I go to a small chapter on puerperal sepsis. What is puerperal sepsis? Infection of the genital tract any time between rupture of membranes. That means onset of labor. So infection of the genital tract any time between rupture of membrane and 42 days postpartum. That is about 6 weeks. Okay. So from the rupture of membrane to about 6 weeks postpartum, if there is an infection of genital tract, it is called as puerperal sepsis as per WHO definition. Along with any two of the following. So how do we make that sepsis? That the patient comes with pelvic pain. Patient has fever. Patient has abnormal vaginal discharge, usually foul smelling. Abnormal vaginal discharge, and it is the smell of the discharge is foul smelling or malodorous. And delay in the rate of reduction of the size of the uterus. Normally it is less than 2 centimeters. If it is less than 2 centimeters per day in first 8 days, then we call it as delay in the rate of reduction. So if there is a evidence of infection along with any two of the following: pelvic pain, fever, abnormal vaginal discharge, smell of the discharge, malodorous, foul smelling, and delay in the rate of reduction of the size of the uterus, then we call it as puerperal sepsis. Now this is of the genital tract. Then there is there can be a sepsis in the postpartum period because of other reasons also, and that is called as a peripartum sepsis. Okay, puerperal sepsis is in the genital tract. Peripartum sepsis is because of the infection in any other part, like a urinary tract infection, like mastitis, pneumonia, abdominal infections, or otherwise tropical infections like malaria and dengue. What are the risk factors for puerperal sepsis? Prolonged labor. You know, there is a rupture of membrane, and then the whole genital tract is exposed to the external environment, and therefore prolonged labor is a risk factor. If there are operative interventions, particularly in the rural settings where the asepsis is not properly followed, if there is a prior vaginal infection, if there is a postpartum hemorrhage, or if there is a wound hematoma, episiotomy is done and there is a wound hematoma, hematoma will attract all the bacteria, so there will be an abscess. And the commonest cause is retained pieces of placenta. This is that is what is the cause of puerperal infection. What is the etiology? The commonest etiology is E. coli, as you know. Then group A, streptococci. In addition to this, now there can be any other bacteria which is causing infection, but staphylococci usually don't cause puerperal sepsis. They are implicated in breast abscess or mastitis. So E. coli is the commonest, and group A, streptococci, is the next common cause of the puerperal sepsis. Investigations, as you know, CBC. So there should be a leukocytosis. Most important is blood culture. Collected in aseptic, under the aseptic conditions, the 2 samples we should send for blood culture, CRP levels and arterial blood gases. What are the clinical features? There is fever, tachycardia, tachypnea. There is abdominal pain, there is a foul discharge. If this sepsis is going, advanced sepsis, it will cause a septic shock, which is evidenced by hypotension, oliguria, hypoxia, and altered consciousness. So this is a serious condition. And ultimately, this septic shock will cause multi-organ failure. What will be the management? First, suspect it at the earliest. After suspecting it, send the appropriate investigations and start appropriate antibiotics at the onset. Early appropriate antibiotics, they should be, preferably 3rd generation cephalosporins or ESBLs, extended spectrum beta-lactamase inhibitors. Supportive care and control, source control. Okay, so whatever is, suppose there is a hematoma or there is abscess which has already formed, we have to drain it. There could be retained products of conception, retained products of placenta. Then again you will have to enter and do the curating. So that source we'll have to remove. So till then, and of course this is under the antibiotic cover, so we have to give appropriate antibiotics, supportive care in the form of nutrition. It may be intravenous nutrition, it may be glucose, it may be saline, to maintain her blood pressure, oxygenation, and control the source. So this is roughly what I wanted to share with you about puerperal sepsis. In our family practice, after the delivery, if the patient starts getting fever or starts getting some pain or starts getting some abnormal vaginal discharge, she will consult you first. So you are the first person to suspect it. And therefore, it is very important that we have a high index of suspicion in diagnosing puerperal sepsis. So please inquire about the duration of the labor, whether there was any instrumentation done, where the delivery has taken place, because even today in many places there is a home delivery where the people are not following the aseptic precautions and therefore they invite for this infection. Thank you very much.
Let's begin our second session. Epilepsy, or I would rather call it as a seizure disorder and acute surgical conditions in pregnancy. Seizure disorder pre-pregnancy evaluation. This is a patient who has come to you saying that, Doc, I have been on anti-epileptics and now I want to plan a pregnancy. So the approach will be, if patient has had a 2-year seizure-free period, because now we know that the patient has a 2-year seizure-free period, no seizures in last 2 years, then we can consider tapering of medicine and stopping medication. But that 2-year period is very much required. If that is gone, 2 years are over, then we evaluate the patient with regards to tapering and stopping medicine. And if she is under care of a neurophysician, we talk to the neurophysician for the same, because the best option is to stop the medication and then let them conceive. If the 2-year period is not over, and or the neurophysician says, no, you must continue, I can't risk stopping, then you have to evaluate safety of the drug for fetus. I will tell you how you have to evaluate that. We will help you there. That is one of a good offering from IDG. Check blood level of drugs going on. Now, this is the most important thing. And I use it in my practice for every patient who's on anticonvulsant. Need not be for pregnancy evaluation. Because what happens is, a patient is on medication and patient gets a breakthrough seizure. While medicines are going on, patient gets a seizure. So we ask a question, did you sleep less? Because we know sleep deprivation is a common cause for seizure, even in a patient who's controlled. We ask for missing of medicine, but we never think, or rather we seldom think to check for therapeutic level of the drug going on. I learned it in the hard way. A patient of mine, she was a medical student, she was on anti-epileptics, and every 6 months she'll get a seizure and they'll change the medicine. Till one day she told me that now I am tired of all this, so we did the therapeutic level. All the 3 anticonvulsants she was on had subtherapeutic level. So now all patients of mine every 6 months go through a therapeutic level and we have a higher chance of stopping the medication after 2 years. Evaluate dose adjustment. In pregnancy, because of the pregnancy, the drug elimination is going to be much more. You will have to upwardly titrate the dosage. Now, this lady is not come to you for pre-evaluation. She has come to you saying, Doc, I am on medication, but I didn't plan, I don't know, but I am pregnant. So what do we do? I am now not going to think of stopping the medication, because seizure is the last thing I want. Even if it has been a 3-year seizure period, I cannot risk a seizure then. Then my other steps become the same. I need to evaluate safety of fetus, check blood level of drugs going on. I need therapeutic dosage. And see, normally you see that all your thyroid patients in pregnancy or pregnant patients who go on thyroid medication, we check thyroid levels more often. I check all my epilepsy or seizure patients every 2 months. I check drug levels because I need to adjust the dosages. And dose adjustment. This is a website you are seeing on our logo. We have IDG. This is a website of IndianDoctorsGuide.com. This site was made in 2008, and I will take you to this site and actually show you how to search for the drugs. The registration to this site is free. On the right lower corner, you have to click register. There is a code required, otherwise there is a blue lettering, write to us. You write to us, we will send you a code, you register and you log in. There is a ready reckoner. I click on drugs. All the drugs have been arranged alphabetically or drug groups. So I go to drug groups. I go to anticonvulsants. Now I see carbamazepine. So what I am about to show you, 733 drug molecules have been classified here like this. mechanism of action, indication, dosage, risk profile, pediatric, geriatric, pregnancy. Now, carbamazepine in pregnancy is contraindicated, may lead to teratogenic effects, usually not prescribed. Lactation, use with caution. Hepatocompromised patient, renocompromised patient. For every drug, there are special precautions. Then there are adverse effects, and then there are drug interactions. We often give multiple drugs together. Although this is my own side, but I was to give haloperidol to a patient who was on phenytoin sodium as well as phenobarbital, and I got really big help from the thing. Then, since I'm an anticonvulsant, I have more drugs in this category, and I can search anything. Go to phenytoin, pregnancy contraindicated. So, register at IDG, and for any drug, any molecule, you can check out whether the drug is safe in pregnancy, lactation. If at times you don't know the dosage, everything you can get. And very soon, this is going to be available as an app for our mobile phones, because general practitioners go for a lot of house calls and they need to understand. Secondly, patients may go to 3 different specialists, but those specialists will never check out drug interaction. It always falls on us. These 4 drugs, you can check therapeutic levels: phenobarbital, valproic acid, carbamazepine, and phenytoin sodium. Now, one specific thing you have to remember: when you advise to the patient that they have to take phenobarbital or valproic acid levels, you have to give a prescription where you have to write that the last dose taken of the particular drug was how many milligram and when was it. So if a patient is taking a morning dose, you have to write there 400 milligram of carbamazepine taken. Tell the patient to write exact time that the tablet was taken, because based on the last dose taken, they calculate the therapeutic level and tell you. So always, this is not a simple advice carbamazepine levels. No, you have to write patient what medicines are on and last dose taken at what time. Then a seizure during pregnancy. The patient is pregnant, going on 1 to 3 months. They not come to you initially. Patient has not had a seizure before. A seizure in pregnancy is eclampsia unless proved otherwise. New onset of generalized grand mal seizure. Eclamptic seizures are not focused seizures, not absent seizures. Generalized convulsion and or coma in the setting of preeclampsia with no other neurological pathology. You may not have diagnosed preeclampsia, but even if you have no history of preeclampsia, but consider that seizure as eclampsia only. It typically occurs during or after the 20th week of gestation or in the postpartum period. It is a complication of preeclampsia. So if you are diagnosing and managing a patient with preeclampsia, always be aware. Always let the family know that if she gets a seizure or behaves abnormally, not to wait for you, not to call you, rush to the nearest hospital. Most cases present in 3rd trimester of pregnancy, with about 80% of seizures occurring intrapartum when the delivery is going on, or within the first 48 hours following delivery. Other than early detection of preeclampsia, no reliable test or symptom complex predicts development of eclampsia. So you can only keep looking for preeclampsia, and if there is preeclampsia, keep managing it well, keep monitoring it regularly, blood pressure, protein in urine, so that eclampsia can be avoided. Manifests as one seizure or more, with each seizure generally lasting 60 to 75 seconds. Many a times, if the patient is in your clinic or you go for a visit, this information will help you. It is one seizure, 1 minute to 1 minute 15 seconds. There are two phases. First phase lasts 15 to 20 seconds and begins with facial twitching. The body becomes rigid, leading to generalized muscular contraction. This is tonic-clonic. So in first phase of 15-20 seconds, this starts. Phase 2 lasts about 1 minute, starts in the jaw, moves to the muscles of the face, eyelids, and then spreads throughout the body. Tonic-clonic movements. This is, remember, a grand mal seizure. In today's times, like this is a tip which I have been using, I am sure many of you are using. We have always learned that when you want to diagnose epilepsy or treat a seizure disorder, you must have eyewitness account. Today, with most telephones, mobile phones having video cameras, that is the best eyewitness account you can get. I tell the patient, if the child or the adult starts getting a seizure, one of you start recording, one of you try to hold the child in the lateral position so that the tongue doesn't fall back and then choke the child. Then, after phase 2, there is coma or a period of loss of consciousness lasting for any amount of period. It could last for few minutes to maybe few hours. But one thing is certain, I may be a very bold, aggressive doctor, but eclampsia or a seizure in a pregnant woman, I am going to rush fastest to the nearest hospital. After the coma, patient may regain some consciousness and becomes agitated. As in any other seizure, we have post-ictal confusion, post-ictal forgetfulness. The patient has no recollection of seizure. A period of hyperventilation occurs after the tonic-clonic seizure. And that hyperventilation should not make you think it is hysterical. Management, although we will not manage, I am just telling you so that you are aware of what is happening. Eclamptic convulsions are life-threatening emergencies and require proper treatment to reduce maternal morbidity and mortality as well as fetal mortality. Because most children may die. That is why the common dialogue in movies, माँ को बचाना है या बच्चे को बचाना है. Delivery is the only definitive treatment for eclampsia. Magnesium sulfate intravenous treatment of seizures, or it may be used to prolong the labor. As we said, that delivery is the only treatment for eclampsia, but the mother is very preterm. She is 28, 30, 27 weeks, and you want to delay delivery. You want to give the mother antenatal corticosteroids. Then you may use magnesium sulfate for 48 hours postponement of the delivery. But in an ICU, in a tertiary care hospital, or with good support of neurophysician, fetal medicine and a gynecologist. These are the conditions which require team support. Take home message from this. Increased drug clearance during pregnancy may lower circulating anti-epileptic drugs, resulting in loss of seizure control and upward titration of dosage. As I said, that in pregnancy, the drug excretion is higher So therapeutic levels may become low. Patient has a risk of getting seizures. So when you are giving drugs which are safe, you may have to adjust the dosage higher in pregnancy. Intrauterine valproate exposure is associated with lower IQ values, neurodevelopmental delay, and autism. As far as possible, better avoid valproate in pregnant women or those planning for pregnancy. Acute surgical conditions, not very uncommon. The incidence and clinical presentation of surgical disease in acute abdomen, all conditions will present the same way in pregnant as in non-pregnant patient. The same pain, vomiting, constipation, different thing. A total of 1.5 to 2% of all pregnancies undergo non-obstetric surgical intervention. A surgery during pregnancy, but for not obstetric causes. And today, when most pregnancies are precious pregnancies, either successful after an IVF or elderly mother, then even that 1.5-2% becomes a high percentage. The most common surgical disorders in pregnancy are acute appendicitis, acute cholecystitis, acute or recurrent pancreatitis, intestinal obstruction, benign ovarian cysts, adnexal torsion, trauma, fall of the mother, or if there's another small child, mother is lying down on floor or bed and the child jumps on the mother, and breast disease or abscess, this is most likely to be postpartum. Limited imaging is performed if advantage outweighs risks. Now, let us see in all these conditions, where do I need an X-ray? I need an X-ray basically when I have a perforation of the bowel or I have an intestinal obstruction where I want to see the air fluid levels. If the patient is in second trimester or late second or early third, you can risk a X-ray exposure of a very low power machine. But ultrasound will give the same image, this thing. USG is the mainstay. Appendicitis, till first 2 trimesters, you may be able to pick up an inflamed appendix on ultrasound. But third trimester, you require a high resolution ultrasound with graded compression technique. A routine ultrasound with an ordinary probe, you may not be able to pick up inflamed appendix. So if a third trimester, look for a good center which has a high resolution ultrasound. Cholecystitis, pancreatitis, our ultrasound will give good inputs. Of course, along with that in pancreatitis, I will do amylase lipase. Intestinal obstruction, again, like this is my thought, I have not done it yet, but in a patient, can the sonologist do standing ultrasound? Then I will get multiple fluid levels because I always do a standing X-ray abdomen. Benign ovarian cyst during the first 14 to 16 weeks are often corpus luteal cysts which spontaneously resolve. So remember that if the first ultrasound of the pregnant woman shows a benign ovarian cyst, do not panic, follow up in 4 weeks and see whether it is increasing or it is resolving. Adnexal torsion is an emergency. Whatever the stage of pregnancy or gestation, it has to be operated. As is ectopic pregnancy. I have not written ectopic pregnancy here because I am talking on a pregnancy which is going on normally. Trauma again is an emergency based on what is the damage or the likely damage. Again, a good ultrasound maybe transvaginal and upper abdominal. Breast is more postpartum, and breast generally does not require imaging, maybe an ultrasound if you want to do a breast abscess aspiration. What caution we have to exercise? Ovarian masses, if you have a mass, not a simple cyst, then delay the excision if possible till 14 weeks. Unless one of the following three are present, cyst is continuously enlarging. Your serial sonographies are showing that the mass or the cyst is continuously enlarging. It is tender. Probe tenderness can be elicited. It has a characteristic of malignancy, a solid component, irregular shape, multiple septae, high vascularity. Second trimester is the safest for non-urgent surgery. Urgent surgery in any trimester should not be delayed if systemic infection or severe disease with higher risk of to mother or fetus. See, understand this. Suppose I am delaying a surgery of appendicitis, saying that let me control with medication. That surgical removal of appendix versus that appendix ruptures and you land up with peritonitis, your headache is going to be 100 times more. Or similarly, cholecystitis. So, surgery can be done in any trimester. Of course, you need to have a gynecologist standing there along with a surgeon. Again, a good setup, a good anesthetist. Anesthesia should be regional. We have to avoid general anesthesia because it is also going to affect the child. So we will do regional anesthesia. Any abdominal part, we would rather do spinal. Pregnancy depends largely on extent of disease and diagnosis. Does not change due to pregnancy. Sorry, it's not pregnancy. The word is pathology or prognosis. Sorry. Prognosis depends largely on the extent of disease, does not change due to pregnancy because we have seen that the presentation is always same in pregnancy. So appendix, which normally non-pregnant woman will be able to remove easily, in pregnant also it can be removed easily with due attention given to the fetus. There are certain physiological changes in pregnancy that we have to be careful about. These are not emergencies, but I am just telling you because every condition in pregnancy need not be treated. 30 to 50% increase in plasma volume during pregnancy affects cardiac output and may alter drug distribution and laboratory test results. So you have to always look for every drug. Whichever drug the patient is taking and the patient conceives, check whether pregnancy requires a dose titration either upward or downward. Plasma volume rises much more than the cell mass. So if plasma rises X times, cell mass rises Y times, Y being lower than X, overall there is dilution. This can lead to physiological anemia because RBCs per 100 cc will show that much hemoglobin per 100 cc. So a slight anemia is physiological, it is not deficiency. Always look at the values of MCHC because that is the most sensitive indicator of iron deficiency. Increased interstitial fluid is seen as mild edema in legs. All mild edema in legs need not be treated if the blood pressure is normal and if there is no protein in urine. Both systolic and diastolic pressures typically drop during early second trimester, gradually returning to baseline by term. So if you are giving a patient some medication for gestational hypertension, in second trimester, they may have to be withdrawn or the dose may be reduced. Pulmonary residual capacity decreases due to limitation of diaphragmatic push. Diaphragm is pushing upwards. As the gestation age increases, patient will complain of breathlessness or not a comfortable breathing or air hunger. That is not pathological. Increased renal blood flow results in increased eGFR and lower serum creatinine and low BMI value. If a patient had a normal creatinine of 0.9 before pregnancy and it drops to 0.6 in pregnancy, that need not worry you. Then Alka ma'am talked of puerperal sepsis. Now, besides sepsis, a pregnant patient, once out of the hospital and maybe in the first month or second month get fever, we are the first point of contact. Postpartum fever is defined as a temperature of 101.6 Fahrenheit or more for first 24 hours and more than or equal to 100.4 on any two of the first 10 days postpartum. There is varied etiology, but the commonest cause is endometritis, especially if it has been a surgical delivery. The infection is usually polymicrobial, not a single organism, requiring administration of antibiotics with specific activity against anaerobes. Whatever you are giving, if you're treating yourself, make sure you are giving an anaerobic bacteria, antibiotic or maybe metrogyl. Other causes besides endometritis is atelectasis, UTI and pyelonephritis. In the first talk, I had said that pregnant women are more at risk of getting pyelonephritis from UTI. So that risk continues immediate postpartum. Surgical wound infection, if episiotomy or cesarean section. Septic thrombophlebitis, because the patient is in bed and there has been some pelvic surgery, and mastitis. So again, a very specific focus question about breast pain, because a new mother may feel that, oh, breast is paining because of engorgement. And if they say yes, then whether it is similar on both sides, and if it is engorgement, then after giving a feed, does it reduce? Identify the cause through rational history and investigations. Appropriate antibiotics in consultation with obstetrician, neonatologist if breast milk is given. If child is only on top feed, then we need not worry about the antibiotic entering the child. Supportive therapy, I am very positive about hydration. Hydration should never be forgotten, and care of nipples and care of wound if there is a surgery. Other postpartum issues where we can be contacted, more so the female general practitioner, vaginal discharge. Now I have a site called Just Eves, JUSTEVS.com. I'll show you the site. We have articles on leukorrhea as well as non-specific vaginitis. And then young mothers, especially first-time mothers, have a lot of breast problems. So we have another site. I'll show you these both sites. And then constipation and piles is very common in the postpartum period that we'll have to treat. Because you know what happens now? Normal delivery or cesarean, patient has been straining because the uterus was pushing down, so they develop piles. Once they develop piles, after the delivery, the mothers do not look after their health at all. It is only the baby. So they forget their diet, forget their intake of water. So constipation and or piles is something which you have to handle and maybe preventive. Give them roughage diet, give them papaya, give them palak soups, give them lot of water, and very clearly on the prescription you'd write in capital letters, no straining while passing stools. And stretch marks, that is another worry. I'm not talking of mother worries of when will I get my pre-pregnant shape back, but stretch mark is something again where you have to talk to them about exercises, because the skin which has been stretched beyond its own capacity has to recoil in a systematic way, then only stretch marks will go away. This is the site called justease.com. There is a section here called Tell Me More About. And here I have a leukorrhea and I have non-specific vaginitis. Those of you who want to read can go there and read it here. And then there is a site called growingwell.com. I'll give you the name. In the left upper corner, there is a section called Mother's Corner. And common problems occurring in the first week of breastfeeding. I think all practitioners should read this because this will be a big help in managing our patients. www.growingwell.com and Mother's Corner. These sites are made by me. I would be saying here me, not us, because these are made in 2000, 2001 when I didn't have a company. I was working on my own. So you can go there or you can guide your patients there. And just received a confirmation. Webinar 19, Approach to Fever in Children by Dr. Suhas Prabhu, Senior Pediatrician, PD Hinduja Hospital. We have done MBBS together. So Suhas normally would tell me I only talk to MD pediatricians, not to GPs. But when I asked him that I want you on this webinar series, he said yes. So he'll be talking to us for about an hour. I'm trying to get another friend to talk on postpartum psychosis and postpartum depression. Any one of you who have specific questions about fever in children can start sending in advance so we can give it to Suhas and he'll be more than willing to answer. Thank you very much. Bye.